Hi everyone, welcome back. We're going to continue on now and hopefully we can get through the remainder of this process in this one video. In the last video we added this backdrop in and we imported our objects and sort of just composed them, positioned them ready to be rendered. What I want to do is basically lock this backdrop object off by freezing its transformations and deleting its history. So what we'll do is just select the backdrop object, come up to modify freeze transformations, and that basically will reset all of its translate, rotate and scale values. And then what we'll do is get rid of the input history here by going to edit, delete by type history. And that just clears that up. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add a light to the scene. Now what we're going to do is just very basic single point lighting in this case. With your 3D scenes, basically you light them specific to the requirements or specific to the look that you're trying to achieve. So depending on what you're doing, you might use one light, you might use 3 lights for a 3-point lighting system, or you might use 100 lights depending on what you're trying to do. So what we're going to do is just take a very basic look at this and just use a single light. I'm going to come over to the Create tab, or the Create menu I should say, at the top of the screen, and I'm going to come down to lights and I'm going to select a directional light just here. So we'll add that in. Now basically what that's done is it's added the light to the middle of the grid. So if you have a look down here, we can see this little green arrow. I'll just turn off this resolution gate for a second so we can kind of see that down there. Now the size of this light makes no kind of difference to the way that the light illuminates the scene. So to make it a little more easily viewable and selectable, I'm just going to use the scale tool on the light and I'm going to scale it up using the middle handle on the manipulator like this, just to make the light really big. Now the directional light is basically represented by these 3 arrows and they're pointing in the direction that the light is pointing. So it's pretty straightforward to kind of work out what this is doing. Now with a directional light, the position of the light in the scene doesn't matter. The angle of the light is what dictates the direction of the light. Placing the object or placing the light where it is now is will have the exact same lighting effect on the scene as if I position this light over here, for example. It's actually the angle or the direction that we rotate the light that changes it. Now in order to see that occurring, I'm going to come up to the top of the viewport and I'm going to press this Use All Lights button, and you'll start to see the scene very basically illuminate. So you can see when I move this light into different positions, the lighting on the objects doesn't change at all. Okay, if I move this up or down, even if it goes down below the object, you can see there it doesn't change. But as soon as I rotate the object like this, you can see that the light changes. So a directional light is based on the direction it's facing, not the position that it's in within the universe. And that makes it one of the more easy lights to adjust when you're starting out with this stuff. So all I'm doing is just positioning this in a spot where I can easily select it. Okay. Technically I could have left it in the middle of the grid and just rotated it the direction I wanted it to illuminate from, but it would make it difficult to select. So just scaling it up like this and moving it out over to the side makes it a bit easier to control. Okay, sometimes I might deselect it and maybe do something over here, maybe move a can around a little bit like this, and then I need to get back to the light so I can just click back on it. Okay, so we want to change a couple of settings for this light. At the moment, it's not going to create any shadows on our objects because, for whatever reason, the lights in Maya default with their shadows switched off. So I'm going to come across to the Attribute Editor on the right-hand side tab, and I'm going to change some of these settings. The first thing I want to do is turn off the Emit Specular just here. Now the specular, you may remember from your material phase of the project, the specular highlights on the materials, the plastics for example, are these kind of white, shiny, very bright spots. Basically they're caused by lights reflecting in reflective surfaces. Okay, now we can actually turn that effect off from just this light. So the light will illuminate the scene, okay, but it won't be reflected as a little specular highlight. Now I've turned that off because we've got a reflection image that's sort of doing a similar thing already embedded within the materials themselves. You can play around with turning this on and off, and we can turn this on and do a quick test render and see what it looks like, and then we can turn it back basically either from on to off or off to on, and try it the other way around. Do a quick test render and see if it looks better or if it looks worse with it turned on or off. So for the time being, I'm going to leave it switched off. Now what I want to do is turn shadows on. So under the shadows drop down, I'm going to expand that out and then scroll down, and what I'm looking for is ray trace shadows. Just here, this ray trace shadow attribute. Just underneath that is a use ray trace shadows. I want to turn that on. So shadows are now activated for this light. Now you'll need to, if you add another light, you have to turn this on for that light as well if you want that light to cast shadows. It's a per object setting. It doesn't just turn lights on for every light in the scene. This one is just for this light. Each light has its own tick box. Okay. The next thing I want to do is increase the ray depth limit just here. So this depth limit, generally in most 3D software packages, refers to the number of surfaces lights can pass through while they're rendering, basically. So primarily I'm thinking about the transparent plastic on the bottle. Basically at the moment the bottle is formed out of 4 layers of polygons. If light was passing from this light and it hits the bottle, it's going to hit the outside shell of polygons. It will pass through them because they're transparent, and it will hit the closest inner surface polygons. It'll then travel through the bottle to the other side and hit the inner surface opposite polygons. It'll go through those to the outer surface polygons on the back of the bottle, and then continue out through the back. So it's 4 different sets of polygons this has to travel through. So what I'm going to do is increase the ray depth limit to 1 above that to 5, and that's just to give me a little bit extra. Technically I think I could set it to 4, but what this should allow me to see is a sort of a semi-transparent shadow. So we should actually see like maybe a little bit of transparency in the shadow because it's been cast off a transparent object. Depending on the software you're using, sometimes if this number is too low, it will actually cause the polygons to just render solid black and you won't be able to see through them. Lightwave in particular renders its polygons like that if its ray depth limit isn't high enough. So just keep in mind, if you're using transparent polygons, you probably have to increase your ray depth, and it's the number of polygons that the light will pass through. Okay, this light angle, you can play around with that a little bit. What this will do is give you soft edge shadows instead of sharp or hard edge shadows on your object. Generally I wouldn't increase that value more than say 2, maybe 3, and if you increase that value you have to set your shadow rays quite a bit higher. What the shadow rays do is basically it softens the effect that you get on the soft edge shadows. The soft edge shadows by default, when you increase this number, basically it turns the edges of the shadows very noisy. It just basically makes the edges go all speckly, and the higher this shadow rays number, the finer and softer the speckles are. Okay, so generally if you're going to put that above 0, this needs to go up, and I would probably start at around about 10 to 15 for the shadow rays if you increase this number. Alright, I'm not going to do that because it increases your render time. This will make it take the software longer to generate your picture in the end. And that could be anywhere between like an extra 5, 10, 15 or 20 minutes potentially. So I'm not going to do that, but feel free to play around with this if you've got sort of a bit of time to spare if you're kind of racing through this project. Okay, that's more or less it. There's not really anything else that we need to change here. The only other settings I would point out, the color obviously changes the color of the light. So, you know, like if you change it to red, you're going to get a red light like this. You can play around with using warm lights or cool lights. So to create a warm light, just change the color to a slightly off-white yellow. So like if you select yellow here, and then you dial the saturation slider, this S value slider, if you dial it back almost to pure white, what you're getting there is a slightly yellow tinged light. It might be a little bit difficult to see on this recording, but I'm getting basically a slightly tinged light. That's a warm light. Now if you want a cool light, what you need to do is switch it to blue. So if I go full blue and then dial that down, okay, you're going to get what's called a cool light. So it's got blue, more blue in the spectrum, or it's closer to blue in the spectrum. Now you probably don't want to go this really kind of purpley blue. I push it more into cyan or light blue, and that's going to give you a much cooler color on your light. Now if you're using more than one light, you can experiment by having some lights very cool and some lights very warm. The other setting you can play around with is intensity, and this is the brightness of the light. Generally speaking, I wouldn't go above 1, and that's a combined value of 1 for all the lights in the scene. That's sort of just to keep them a little bit more controllable. So if I've got 2 lights in the scene and one is set to maybe 0.6, okay, the other light would be set to 0.4. All right, so that totaled up, their combined intensity is still only about 1. All right, so you can play around with the intensity as well if you like. I'm going to set mine to about 0.8, like that. And I'm just going to set the color to white. I don't particularly need a warm or a cool color for this. In particular because my image is going to be, it's going to have green in it, so that's going to be sort of probably pushing more to a cooler spectrum, more towards blue. Okay, so that's our light setup. Now, obviously you can play around with the angle of the light. Now, if you want, if your graphics card is good enough, you can also turn on this shadows button, and you might find that you can actually get shadows to cast in real time, and that's a nice way of being able to kind of judge where they're going to end up. So, you know, you can grab the move tool and kind of move it around, and you can sort of see how the shadows are going to fall. So, you know, I might have mine like that, perhaps. Okay, if my camera is going to be about here, then, you know, I'm going to see some shadows casting across. Or what I could do is actually swing it around this way so that I end up seeing a bit of shadow out here. The only thing I don't like about that is having this shadow here off this can on the bottle. So, you know, I might kind of bring this back a bit more. Now, obviously, the further vertical you make the light, the shorter the shadows get on the ground. So if you put this very, very horizontal like this, you're going to get these really kind of weird shadows going up the back wall. I would probably have it more vertical than anything else. So, you know, perhaps something like that would work quite well. Likewise, something like that would probably work too. So I might just leave that like that. Now, generally speaking, when I'm not using the shadow, once I've got kind of the light position, normally what I do is just turn off shadows and turn off the light settings as well, just to save on system memory and so on. Okay, so that's pretty much done. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color to my backdrop object. So I'm going to select the backdrop, I'll right click and hold and come down to assign favorite material. I'm just going to select a lambent. Okay, that's over here. And I'm going to click on the color channel input just down the end. And from the create render node, I'm going to select textures underneath mental ray, and I'll select MIB AMB occlusion. Now we used this in one of the shaders for, I think, the can earlier on, and I think even in the bottle we used one. Samples, you know, just increase that. I'm going to set it to 32. Usually 32 or 64 would suffice for most of these kind of little projects. The brightness color, that's going to be the color of my background. So if I want it blue, I'm going to select blue. If I want it green, I'll select green, and so on. I would probably not make this too saturated. So for example, I wouldn't make it like this color blue, something like this. That's just going to make you go cross-eyed when you're looking at it. I would try and push more for like a neutral color. So, you know, for me, because I've got like these green labels on my object, I'm going to maybe push for sort of like a pale green, or maybe even like into an olive drab kind of color. Okay, but you know, the color's up to you. The dark value, you can either leave it as black, or you can, for a slightly more subtle value, you can just make a slightly darker color of the version that you've got for bright. So, you know, if I select the bright color here, which is this green, I can then just dial this back down into this dark, like very dark green. So I've got, oops, that messed up. Got to make sure I click the right thumbnail here. So I've got light, sort of pale green, and then dark green. The spread I'm going to leave. The max distance, I'm going to set that to 1. I'm going to leave everything else as it is. I've got reflective turned off. Switching reflective on was what caused those lines to appear, these lines here. That was the reflective activated. So make sure you don't switch that on, and that'll make sure you don't have those green lines or dark lines showing up. All right, so that's it for the background. I'll just click the object again, and I'm just going to rename that background shader. So I'm just going to call that, I'll just call it BG shader, like that. So background shader. Okay. So that's basically the lights, the backdrop, and all the objects ready to go. All I have to do now is set my render settings and position my camera, and I can start rendering. So first things first, I'm going to turn on my resolution gate again, just here, and I'll position my camera in a sort of a nice spot, something like this. Okay, so I'm kind of happy with those positions. Now what I want to do is turn the background color for my camera. I want to just kind of increase the brightness of it. We're not actually going to see this color, but it's going to impact our lighting. So I'm going to come up to this little camera attributes button, or you can go view. Let's see, you can go select the camera just here. Different versions of this software have slightly different layouts in this menu. There we go. Camera attribute editor. This is the one that we want. So you can either click here, or you can click this button. But yeah, some of this software has slightly different, has items in slightly different spots. All right, so this is our camera. You can see that the light, the outline here has gone white. So that's indicating that the actual perspective camera is selected, and we can see the attributes for it here. What I want to do is scroll down and look for environment just here. We'll just turn that on. The background color black, that's the default background color for every camera. So what I want to do is change this. Now, depending on how bright I make this, it will make the render brighter. All right, so this is going to kind of add to the overall lighting in the scene. So I might not want to go pure white with this. I might want to back it off slightly. Okay. Now keep in mind as well, if you put a color in this, it's probably going to tinge the color of the whole render. So I would probably try and keep this to a grayscale. I would keep it probably no darker than this. So sort of between white and sort of this maybe 30% gray color. All right. So I'm going to come up to the render settings now, which is this little clapperboard with 2 dots next to it. And what we're going to do is set up all of our render settings in here, and then we can start the render. So I'm going to render using mental ray, which is down here. I have to do that because we've used some mental ray nodes in some of the shaders, and without using mental ray, the shaders won't work properly, and the objects will either not render at all, or they might render with errors, or just be completely black. So we need to make sure we're using mental ray for this. Once again, if you haven't got mental ray in the list, you'll need to come up to Window, Settings Preferences, Plugin Manager, and what you want to do is look for the Maya to MR plugin just here. On a Mac it'll say .bundle, and on the PC it's got .mll. Just make sure both of them are ticked. Newer versions of the software, it doesn't list it up here alphabetically with the rest of the plugins. It puts it down here in its own category. So if it's not up here, it might be at the bottom. Okay, so we'll just close that off. So if you've got Mental Ray in there selected in the list, on the Common tab, we've already set our image size. I'm just going to scroll right down to the bottom to Render Options. I'll unfold that and turn off Enable Default Light. Okay, and that's going to disable the standard viewport lighting. So just the light that we've added is going to affect the scene. Then I'm going to come across to Quality. Now when you click this tab, usually it takes a while for it to open because it's loading all these settings in. Quality presets right at the top. I'm going to set this to Production, just here. Okay, and that's going to turn on our ray tracing, which our light is going to use. It's a calculation that our lights use for generating shadows, but also it allows the render to kind of recognize transparent polygons and reflections and so on as well. Multi-pixel filtering just here. I'm setting the filter to Mitchell instead of Gauss. If we leave it on Gauss, it will blur the image slightly, and I don't want a blurred image. Just about everything else we can leave. If you go down into ray tracing, you can check your max trace depth. Basically all of these values are probably high enough to leave as they are. Perhaps the shadows, I might increase this. You can see here the tooltip says reflected or refracted objects at trace depth beyond this limit don't compute shadows from Mylight. So basically this is what I was talking about earlier on with the light not being able to penetrate through enough polygons to generate shadows through objects when they're transparent. So what I want to do is just increase that value to 5. That should give us enough depth calculations to be able to get the shadows to cast all the way through. Okay, across to the Indirect Lighting tab, we've only got a couple of settings to do. The first thing I'm going to do is turn on Final Gathering, just here. What this is going to do, it's going to boost the brightness or the lighting of the scene by adding the background color of the camera. So we set that background color to gray over here. So this setting is going to cause the light in the scene to bounce around, and it's going to incorporate the background color, which is this, and kind of use it to boost the brightness of the lighting in the scene a little bit. It will also cause the light to bounce from one object to another, and depending on if you add secondary diffuse bounces, you can actually have color kind of bleeding from one object to another. So for example, if we've got like a green label here, you might see a little bit of green, like a bit of a green tinge around the bottom of the can on the floor, and that's where the light's hitting the can and kind of bouncing off and then hitting the floor, and a bit of that green color is sort of, it's almost being reflected on the floor in this case. If you increase this, it will increase your render time. A lot of these settings will. We can increase point interpolation to improve the quality of this final gather calculation, and that won't really increase render time. The accuracy is also like a quality setting, but unlike point interpolation, accuracy, increasing this makes the image look a little bit better as far as the final gathering is concerned, but it does increase your render time quite a lot. So I would suggest not increasing this maybe more than about 128 or 150, something like that. I'm going to pop it up to about 128, but I mean, you can leave it at 100. Really, it's depending on the speed of your computer. If you're doing this at home and you've got a very sort of brand new computer, or you know, a very high spec computer, you can increase that accuracy even, you know, above 200. And obviously the slider goes up a fair way, but increasing this number increases your render time. Increasing this one doesn't. Okay, more or less that's it. This primary diffuse scale is the only other setting I'm going to adjust. Primary diffuse scale is almost like a darkness or brightness setting. It kind of backs the whole bouncing light effect off a little bit, and sometimes what I'll do is just drop it down a little bit like this, just making it a bit more grey than white. Sometimes it washes your objects out when there's a lot of light in the scene, and it causes everything to just look white. So you can kind of play around with that diffuse scale value if you find things are too bright. Just dial this down. Okay, so I'm just going to close this. That's basically our scene ready to go. I'm going to just slightly adjust the angle on this camera just so I can see a bit of the top of this can, and I'm just going to rotate the can around. Now this is purely just for me because I want to get a slightly different angle on the can because I know where the label is going to be. You know, so you just kind of position it. Likewise, I might just grab the bottle and just kind of rotate that around. If you turn on your textures, you can kind of get an idea of where the label's pointing. You know, so I wouldn't, for example, want to see this side of the label with all the barcode and that on. What I want to see is the actual design on the can or the bottle. So, you know, I might like pop that around so I can read that like that, and then with the can I might have it sort of facing more this way because I think that's where the creeper face is from memory. So that's sort of you know, it's ready to go basically. I'll just turn textures off. So what I'll do is save this. So I'll go File, Save Scene As, and it should be in my Scenes folder. And what I'm going to do is just call this Can and Bottle Demo Render, or something along those lines. Actually, not demo. That was my file that I was testing earlier. So I just call this, you know, Can and Bottle, or just Can, or just Bottle, Final Render. So I know that this is my render scene, and just save that and continue. Okay, so all you do now is you press this button, render the current frame, and you'll see in brackets it says mental ray. So you can click this button and that will open up your render view, and then what you can do is just hit your render current frame button just there, and that will start the rendering process. So keep in mind, when you're rendering, you can see here it's actually resized this window out to the full A4. Now you won't be able to adjust that until the render finishes. So just keep in mind that you know, this render could take an hour, it might take half an hour, it could take 20 minutes, all depending on the settings that you've added. Keep in mind that these settings are just guidelines. It's just a basic way of getting started with getting a really nice clean product shot render. They're not absolute rules. You can tinker around with other settings and see what happens. All of this rendering is kind of trial and error. Play with the settings, see if you can recognize what difference, if any, they're making to the render. So change a setting, do a quick test render, go back, change a setting, render again, and see what the difference is between the renders. Okay. If you need to abort or quit a render, just press escape, and that will basically cancel the render at whatever point it's at. So I'm going to leave this video here, and basically that's it. All you need to do when you have your created, your finished render like this, all you need to do is go File, Save Image, and you can just save it as a JPEG and just give it a name like this, and that will end up in your images folder, and that's the same folder that your UV templates were exported to quite some time ago. So that's it for this project. Basically we're done. So I hope that you've gotten a little bit out of this. Hopefully you've covered some new things, and you've kind of learnt a little bit more about the software, and also learnt a little bit more about the production process, the pipeline that we use for creating still images and little product shots like this. So with that said, I'll leave it here, and I will see you next time.